Hey guys, it's Bible Scribe. Thank you for joining me again. I'm going to speak tonight about the CBV and IBV views of the resurrection. They're preterist views, and they come from specific places, and we're going to talk more about where some of these views come from. But it's two different views of the resurrection that get batted around a lot by preterists. So I'm going to take some time tonight, and we're going to talk about CBV and IBV. And the CBV stands for corporate body view, okay? And I, as you can imagine, stands for individual body view, okay? And both have to do with the resurrection. So let's get to it. I have a few different articles we're going to open and look through and just read some pieces together so that you start to understand these different views. Now, you may understand a little bit about them, and I will grant the fact that probably if you've studied these views or the people that espouse these views on different preterist circuits, then you're going to know more about these views even than me. But I hope that we can at least get to a basic understanding of each view, enough for me to discuss it and then present to you which parts I believe in and what my views are in relation to these views. So let's get into some of that. First, I want to show you just some of an article that's going to help us get started. Again, it's corporate body view and individual body view of resurrection. And here's a list of people, just so you're aware of the different people that talk about these things online in case you want to go find more information. This is a good list here. David Curtis, Gerald Kratt being a CBV, Tony Denton CBV, Ed Stevens IBV, William Bell is CBV, Charles Meek IBV, Rod Stokes, Alan Bonder is CBV, and Kurt Simmons is IBV. And two they didn't mention here that really should be, I think I added them to my list in another set of notes, is Don Preston and Max King, very well-known preterist names of the past couple decades that essentially you're going to find out, are more almost responsible for these views even being discussed. And so that's going to be important as we move forward. But for now, let's move forward to some more understanding of these two views. So right here on your screen, you'll be able to see with me that this section here, the IBV holds to an individual bodily change affected in the afterlife, beginning at the parousia. So that means, just to boil all those words down for you in case you like me like things explained simply, it means that after death, people since the time of 70 AD, the parousia is a mention of the time of 70 AD, Christ's return in the clouds. And so it's saying that from that time forward, that individual people who die, they will have a bodily change, and so they will no longer be in flesh. They will essentially, their spirits will be alive in the afterlife, but not their bodies. So let's keep reading here a little bit to keep fleshing out that idea. IBV views the threat of death as totality death, meaning the death of Adam and Eve were threatened with, and that would happen the very day they ate. Now, this is a key phrase we're going to look at later, okay? And this will come into play when I discuss my views. Just remember this, that a lot of this view centers around this discussion of Adam and Eve in the garden and the, quote, death that they would experience after they ate of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So just realize that's a key component here to this discussion. And it says here that would happen the very day they ate, a penal capital punishment death, it says. So an unnatural forced death from breaking God's command, which would have physically killed them that very day, being the portal into their eternal death. Interesting. So if you're confused at this point, don't worry, because honestly, when I came to these different writings and information about these views, I was quite confused for a while. So stick with me and let's continue to increase our knowledge on these views. So let's go to another article that'll kind of help flesh this out a little bit for us, tell us more. So here we will start reading on this. It's a Facebook post by a guy called the Berean Preterist, and I don't honestly know. This could be one of the people that I listed prior. I don't know exactly, but this was a good little article that helped me get a handle on these views. So this section right in here, starting here and downward. In the individual body view preterism, we see individual souls or persons raised out of Sheol in 70 AD. Again, like I said, it starts with the parousia, meaning 70 AD, when Christ came in the clouds, not when he died and resurrected, okay? So 40 years later, in 70 AD, that's what both the individual body view and the corporate body view are going to be about, okay? It says we see individual souls raised out of Sheol in 70, not physical bodies out of the ground, and certainly not a corporate body, because that, of course, would be referring to the CBV view. And then glorification in 70 AD. So essentially, again, to boil it down, at 70 AD, the individual body view people say that the people that were in Hades at that time were resurrected out of Hades and Sheol, essentially. Sheol is the Hebrew word for Hades, essentially. And they were raised, but not their physical bodies. It was their spirits, their souls, essentially. So continuing, it says, in IBV preterism, we see that those saints who were alive and remaining at the time in 70 AD, so those who were alive at 70 AD, were not partakers in the general resurrection of the souls and persons that were saved out of Sheol. So the general resurrection, they say, was in 70 AD, and it was strictly for the people who were in Sheol or Hades, okay? So the ones that were already dead before that time and in the underworld waiting for redemption. So now this section says, it was those saints who were alive and remaining at the time of the Lord's second coming and general resurrection in 70 AD. So those that were alive still in 70, who dealt with an individual bodily change, and they reference Philippians 3, 1 Thessalonians 4, 1 Corinthians 15, 2 Corinthians 4 and 5. That the live saints in 70 AD, they think, had a bodily change, turned into spirits, and went to heaven, each individually. So that's essentially a kind of rapture doctrine, it sounds like. So that's very interesting. Again, you'll see my views in a little bit on this and how they differ quite heavily from some of this. But this seems to be what the IBV position is. Now you'll note just down below that it says, so much of what is argued between the IBV preterists and CBV preterists is about this bodily change that took place in the first century. So I believe this actually boils down to a type of rapture debate. We'll talk more about that in just a second. So let's read now a little bit about the CBV viewpoint and what it means. So let's go to the articles on that. So in this article, Resurrection, Where Do CBV and IBV First Part Ways by David Clark, let me find the area we want to look at. Make it bigger so you can read it. All right, so in this section, it says, CBV holds that Christ is the resurrection. Now listen to the words, because CBV is a little more hard for people to grasp right off the bat. It's complicated. It's also a metaphorical type of understanding of resurrection. So listen to the wording very closely. CBV holds that Christ is the resurrection. Participation in him involves individual choice and action in a process that began through the cross, implemented on Pentecost, and consummated at the Parousia. Again, at 70 AD is the crucial point for both views. Okay, so here this section is also telling. So let's start here and we'll read downward. CBV spiritualizes the eschatological resurrection. Okay, do you hear that? It spiritualizes the resurrection, equating it with justification from sin and reconciliation to God. So essentially, CBV says that the general resurrection at 70 AD is when it considers that to have occurred, a quote, general resurrection. That is not anyone going anywhere, but that it is rather justification from sin and its reconciliation to God. It's a metaphor for the justification and reconciliation that occurred because of Christ's work. Okay, so CBV spiritualizes the resurrection, equates it with justification and reconciliation to God, which, we'll skip all this stuff in here, we don't need to read that, which they say, I mean CBV believers, which they say did not arrive until 70 AD, when they say the law of Moses was purportedly removed. Okay, now there may be some aspect of that I might somewhat agree with about the law, but to continue, the CBV therefore removes atonement and reconciliation from AD 33. Now this is a key. This is a key to this view. CBV removes the atonement and reconciliation from AD 33 and the cross, relocating it at AD 70 and the fall of Jerusalem, so that the spiritualized view of the resurrection may coincide with Christ's return in those events. Because you see, the CBV view connects the end of the law with this metaphorical view of resurrection or justification. Okay, and so they connect it that way at 70 AD, and then essentially, in a way, and of course, the proponents of CBV would deny this, but they kind of deny the power of Christ's death, burial, and resurrection, which is contrary to some of the scriptures in the New Testament, obviously. But they relocate, as it says, those reconciliation things that Christ did to 70 AD instead of 30 or 33 AD when he died and was resurrected. So in order to, and we'll keep going right here, in order to postpone justification until 70 AD, CBV must therefore argue that the law of Moses was still valid, binding, and obligatory until the fall of Jerusalem, and that it held mankind under condemnation of sin, and without its removal, men could not be justified. See, now that's an interesting statement. Now, right off the bat, I have a red flag going up, and do you know what that is? You may know what it is, but when I read them saying that the law was obligatory and binding until the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD, I have a problem with that, because the book of Acts, we have sections where the Judaizers, the Jews who had become Christians, but then were demanding that all the Christians follow the Jewish law. And here come the apostles with the understanding from Christ himself saying, no, that's not how it works. You don't have to obey the law anymore. So it's wrong of you to tell these new Christians that they need to obey your laws. And so there was this whole conversation, if I'm not mistaken, multiple times about that type of thing. So to me, that's a red flag right off the bat that seems to put a little shadow on this CBV view right away, along with the fact that it seems to diminish Christ's work on the cross, which we can also talk about. So I hope that gives you a little bit of understanding of these two views. And again, like I had said before, I'm still not 100% crystal on all the detail of these views, but I think that is the basis of these views. And now here's where it's going to get a little tougher to understand, and we're going to continue a little further with the CBV view, because I think it's the one that's harder to understand. It seems to have more complexity, more little ins and outs of things you have to change your understanding on. And again, that to me is another one of its kind of weaknesses, is that it doesn't seem to come out of a very plain understanding of the scriptures. It seems to be one of these ideas where if you don't have the veil of the idea on, you're not going to see what they see in the text itself. And to me, that is another red flag. But let's go to this other article that talks more about this view. All right, here on this same article from Facebook from the Berean Preterist, I thought this is a good little segment on the views. So let's read right here and start going down. The CBV guy asserts that this flesh and body, meaning the body of the resurrection, okay, talks to a corporate body of Adam, okay? And this is where it's gonna continue to be confusing, because you have to think, the way it requires you to understand this is to think in terms of everything that's said about resurrection being talking about many people, not just a person. Corporately, like all of humanity or all of Christianity or that kind of thing. So again, that's why I say you have to look through the lens of CBV to even understand the passages in that context, in that mindset. So their talk in the resurrection of the flesh and body to them is a corporate body of Adam, with Adam being the spiritual head of this corporate body, all persons in the sin and death of Adam. The CBV adherents have their corporate body go through a covenantal change status in 70 AD, okay? So this is what, and just so you're aware, it's Don Preston is the one who in the modern time, the current time, is the most vocal and pushes this view the most, okay? And so when he talks about this stuff, that's what it is. It's all of humanity as a corporate body under Adam in sin until 70 AD, and then it changes because of Christ. And that change is not a resurrection, but a reconciliation, okay? And so from 70 AD forward, all of mankind essentially is reconciled. Now, I don't know why in his head that doesn't lead to kind of a universalist mentality where everybody's saved after 70 AD, all humanity, because that's the way it sounds based on what I'm reading. But that's just a comment I have. So let's continue learning here. This corporate body of Adam goes through a covenantal change. Now, Don Preston and the CBV proponents are very covenantal based. And I believe I've done a video on covenant-based theology before, but I generally don't agree with covenant-based theology. But we probably won't go into that in this video. It would take some time. This corporate body of Adam at 70 AD changes into the corporate body of Christ. All right? So, again, everything about the resurrection, instead of being about, each individual person as they die or whatever happens to them, they are resurrected. No, the resurrection it talks about, according to the CBV people, is a very group-oriented thing, and it has to do with mankind and history, and 70 AD as a pivot point, where beforehand all were in, quote, death, and that would be called in CBV, as I understand it, a spiritual death. And then after 70 AD, because of Christ's change of the law, meaning the law now being done away with as far as their teaching. Now, again, this isn't something I would necessarily teach, but they're teaching that the law completely was done away with in 70 AD, which allowed for Christ to then reconcile people to God. And so everyone after 70 AD was part of the corporate body of Christ, not death, but Christ, and were reconciled to God. So that's really the best I think we're going to be able to do tonight with the corporate body view. So I hope you understand the difference. Let me try to boil it down one more time on just a very basic level, so we get the picture. The individual body view is that, and it does focus on 70 AD, just like the corporate body view. Both are focused on 70 AD and Christ's coming in the clouds and the judgment on Israel. In the individual body view, it is that after 70 AD and Christ's finished work, starting from his resurrection, his death, burial, resurrection, all the way through 70 AD, changes the picture. And that there is at that time a general resurrection of the dead people, and they go to heaven, from Hades. So that's not a bodily resurrection. They go to heaven from Hades, the righteous do. But the ones alive in 70 AD also are taken to heaven. They are changed in an instant as a rapture kind of event. And they are taken to heaven at that time. And then everyone who dies after 70 AD, including you and me and anyone else in the future, if you're a Christian, you changed, you become spirit, you go to heaven, okay? And your physical body is not resurrected. All right, that's individual body view, as far as I understand it. And if I have something wrong, you're welcome to comment on that. Now, corporate body view, instead, is that in Adam, all mankind is in sin, okay? And that's the corporate body that will be resurrected, all mankind. Not one person, not each individual person, but this kind of corporate mentality, everybody together, mankind. And that at 70 AD, because Christ in judgment, the temple was destroyed, the law is, quote, finished at that point, he then reconciles everyone to God outside of the law. And in a corporate sense, mankind from that point forward is reconciled to God, is justified, is righteous. And so from then on, everyone is a part of the corporate body of Christ, as they call it. Now, as far as the physical body or the spirit or the soul, I don't really understand at this point. I don't know the particular view on that by the corporate body view people. But I think in general, you see the paradigm that each group is trying to talk about. It all revolves around 70 AD and the resurrection. Was the resurrection talk in the Bible about each individual person being resurrected, which is what the individual body view says partially? Or like the corporate body view, is the resurrection language in the Bible all talking about a corporate resurrection from a dead state to a, quote, live state, meaning righteousness, not meaning going to heaven and all this other stuff? It's a very interesting and, to me, strange view. Both views in their own way are a little bit strange to me. One other thing I'd like to show before we move forward, if I could, is there's this statement here that I'd like you to see, and that is this right here. As I mentioned the name of Don Preston, I also mentioned the name Max King. Max King was Don Preston's tutor. Don Preston actually kind of apprenticed under Max King. And I encourage you, if you're interested in where Don Preston came from and why he believes what he does, I encourage you to go learn a little bit about Max King's doctrine. Do some searches for Max King doctrine, or you might want to try a few searches for the words Max King, heretic, or heresy. That'll give you views of people who disagreed with Max King. And I will tell you that I've looked into Max King's teaching, and I think he was heretical. I think his teaching was ridiculously wrong. And again, that's way beyond the scope of this video. But just to know where some of these views, like corporate body view, if I had to pin it on someone in the modern time, I would pin the corporate body view fully on Don Preston's shoulders right now. And his teaching came from Max King. And here's another section about Max King in order for Max King and Don Preston to make all of this work, he had to define pretty much everything from a very liberal secular theology point of view. It gained popularity in the 50s and 60s. Max King was doing his work in the 70s, 60s and 70s. It says that he was influenced by John A.T. Robinson, who was the founder of secular theology in the 1960s. He was a radical liberal Anglican secular theologian who brought much error and heresy into the religious scene in the 1950s and 60s. Okay, so you see, if that's the heritage of the CBV viewpoint, you can see why, first off, it's very confusing. And then number two, I think why it's completely unfounded in the scripture. And to even understand it, you have to put on a lens. You have to have a certain viewpoint before you come to the scriptures. You can't just, according to the, to understand the CBV view, you can't just read the scripture because it's not from a plain reading of the text. To me, it's actually a very dangerous view because it messes up so much with your ideas of the resurrection and what happened in 70 AD, and then particularly what Christ did at the cross in 30-ish AD. It messes that up so bad that it's like, I don't know if you go to that point, if you can come back and actually have a correct understanding of what Christ did and what it means for you. I'm not saying that a CBV view person cannot be saved. I'm not saying that, but it really messes with your understanding of these things. And this writer and other writers, as I read, were saying that the reason that the CBV people do this and keep this view is because they're trying to shoehorn the entirety of prophecy into 70 AD because they're full preterists. And I'm not going to accuse full preterists necessarily of this view, but it does make sense that when you want to force every single prophecy in the Bible, and I'm mostly talking about the book of Revelation, if you take everything in that book and force it all into 70 AD, you come up with some strange ideas. And that's what happened to Don Preston. And I actually, when I first became a preterist, I watched some of his videos. And while I thought he had some things right about history and the fulfillment of a lot of things in the first century, this part of his viewpoint really sat wrong with me. And his viewpoints on Revelation, he has the view that Revelation is like the same story told 3 times in a row in the book, and that it just is this weird kind of symbolic metaphor that folds over on itself, and then everything in it is talking about 70 AD to him. And that's the way he makes it do that, because he has to. His view demands it, the full preterist view that says everything is past. Everything in the Bible, that from cover to cover, is past. People that have that viewpoint have to find a way to explain that with the Bible. And so in Don Preston, Max King, and John A.T. Robinson's case, it sounds like this was one of the ways they chose to do that, was to make the resurrection a metaphor for something instead of an actual individual person being resurrected to be with God in heaven. That instead it meant this corporate thing. So anyway, not to harp too much, but I think that shows you the foundations of the view, the CBV view at least, and kind of where it came from, and maybe gives you some red flags as well, as far as like, those guys don't sound like they had it all together. Yeah, and that's kind of how I feel. All right, so another thing that's very important to both views, as I said before, remember when I mentioned both views specifically talk about Adam and Eve, right? For instance, here is the vile body that's being changed a corporate body of all persons in the sin and death of Adam. The sin and death of Adam is very important. All right, so back at one of the first articles we read about IBV, but a key thing, like I had mentioned, that is a component of both arguments. the IBV views the threat of death as totality death, meaning the death of Adam and Eve were threatened with, and that would happen the very day they ate. It would have been a penal death. So what they're saying, what both views are saying, IBV and CBV, is that the, quote, death of Adam and Eve when they ate the fruit occurred immediately. And the reason they say that is because of the passages about in Genesis where the Lord warns Adam. He says, in the day you eat of that fruit, you will die. Okay? And we all know that passage. It seems very cut and dry, but I've done studies on this passage. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this so you understand the view that I believe is the correct view on the death of Adam and Eve. Because I learned something about that word day in Hebrew. Okay, and I've done a lot of study now on the Hebrew language. But the word day is one that's problematic in Hebrew, okay, because they have a word for that that's translated to day in English called yom. Okay, that's the word. We would spell it in English Y-O-M, yom. And that word does not mean day like our word day means. It means a time span. And what I've found is I've read many ancient texts that, like Genesis, but others outside the Bible, is that this Hebrew word yom is used for many different time periods and spans, from a day to a year, and even sometimes as 1,000 years. And it's interesting because in the case of Genesis and some of the other texts I've read, and this will be in the first book of Adam and Eve that I'm talking about specifically, that God prophesied to Adam in terms of yom. And in the case of the first book of Adam and Eve, when he did this, he even refined his response to Adam. He said that in 5.5 yom, that he would send the Redeemer to save him from this life, from this new existence, this physical existence that he despised so much because he was used to something different in the garden. And Adam was concerned because of the short time period, and he didn't understand. And so God clarifies, he says, no, the yom I'm talking about are the first 5,500 years of human history. And so we know by that the word yom was used for, in some cases, days, in some cases, years, and in some cases, thousands of years. All those different types of references I have found in ancient writings. So in the book of Genesis, when God tells Adam and Eve, or tells Adam that if you eat of that fruit, you're going to die in the day in which you eat it. Well, guess what word is behind that word day? It's the word yom. Now, tell me how long did Adam live? He lived 930 years, just short of one prophetic yom, as I like to call it, a prophetic yom of 1,000 years. So that statement to Adam by God, that you'll die in the yom that you eat this fruit, if you do it, was 100% true and accurate in a very literal sense, because that time span he was talking about was the first 1,000 years of human history. And Adam almost lived to the end of that 1,000 years, but not quite. Just as God had said, he died in that yom period, that 1,000 years, at the age of 930 years old. So the problem is that these views, the IBV view and the CBV view, don't understand that. In fact, there's not many Christians alive that understand that. And it's just very interesting that that we can gain that understanding from the Hebrew language itself. It's not far-fetched at all, by the way. You can check the things that I'm saying and verify them. So with that understanding, it changes the game a little bit, because both the IBV view and the CBV view, neither of them, they don't take a literal view of Adam's death according to what God said about eating the fruit. However, I do. So when God says you're going to die, and then he dies in 930 years, he died within the first yom that God talked about. He said, you're not going to live past a yom. You'll die in the yom that you eat that fruit. And he did. And so with that clear understanding of Adam's death and what God meant, he didn't mean you're going to have a spiritual death as soon as you put your mouth on that fruit or take a bite. He didn't mean that. But what did happen was that Adam fell from his original state. And so with that clear understanding, we see, there was a more refined, more perfect state that Adam and Eve were in before they fell, they sinned. It changed them. And there are texts that talk about this too. And so they changed into physical forms and had bodies now, physical bodies. They had some kind of bodies before, but they were a little different, okay? And so now with physical bodies, and God telling them you're going to die within 1,000 years, you're not going to live past that, they live their lives out on earth. And when they die, which is the natural state of things that die on earth, if they have a spirit, the spirit goes to Hades. It goes to the underworld. That's the natural understanding of things, the cosmological order that's all through the ancient texts, including the Bible. The name Sheol in Hebrew is the Greek Hades. It's the same word. So those are both the same place, by the way. But you'll see Sheol talked about all through the Old Testament. Whenever anyone dies, they're taken down to Sheol. And that word is translated many times as grave, and people get all confused because they're thinking in an English sense instead of a Hebrew sense. In Hebrew, that was the underworld. Sheol was the place of the dead, that the dead spirits go after a person dies. So with that understanding, you see why I can't accept either of these views. So let me just briefly talk through my views on the resurrection in general. All right, so this is what I consider the correct view of the resurrections. And there were multiple resurrections, including each person possibly at his death. So let's talk through this. When Jesus died, now he already talked about when Adam was in the garden. He ate the fruit. God said, if you do that, you're going to die within a yom. And he did. He died within the first yom, the first 1,000-year time span. And that was known. Then he went to Hades, and every human that died from him forward, after death, their spirit goes to Hades. Their body goes into the ground, their spirit goes to Hades. So I'm trying to be very specific so you understand exactly where I'm coming from on this stuff and what I see in the scriptures. So, as Moses died, he goes to Hades, and he's waiting. Now, there are portions of Hades that are set aside for the righteous. So the book of Enoch actually talks about this. There's areas of Hades that are not like torture. They're not places of torture where demons are whipping people or anything like that. There's portions of Hades that were set aside for retaining the righteous that would go there and wait for the Redeemer, who is Christ, obviously. The Redeemer, by the way, talked about all the way back in history, and even the oldest books of the Old Testament, like the book of Job, it mentions the Redeemer. And I have other videos on the different references to Christ pre-incarnate, before he was a human, referenced in the Old Testament many times. So that understanding is there, okay? And all the people that died in that time period and forward, their spirits go to Hades and their bodies go into the ground, okay? Now, as it shows on your screen in this first section, when Jesus went to Hades, he died. He went to Hades too. His body was in the tomb. His real essence, I guess we could say spirit, but his spirit essentially goes to Hades, okay? And when he did that, he busted down the gates of Hades, broke in. At the dismay of Satan and Hades, the ruler of the underworld, the being named Hades, At their dismay, Christ took the captives in Hades. That's who the captives are. He set the captives free. He took them out of Hades. It says in a few different ancient writings that he then restored those people who were mostly Jews, but then also the Jewish patriarchs and anyone righteous who was in Hades. He restored all those people to paradise. And paradise, of course, is the Garden of Eden. And it makes sense that God would promise Adam prophetically that he would be restored to paradise, because that's where Adam was put originally, right? And so that was the promise. And in fact, the Jewish nation, even in the rabbinical teachings, reiterates this promise that they would be restored to paradise, okay? So when Christ dies and goes down to Hades, breaks the doors down, scares the crap out of Satan and Hades himself, he takes these people, the righteous, out of Hades at that time in 30 AD, and he takes them to paradise. Remember what he said to the thief on the cross? Today you will be with me in paradise. And there's an early Christian writing called the Gospel of Nicodemus that talks about that man's journey to paradise. And so that's what happened in 30 AD. After he delivers those righteous dead spirits to paradise, and this resurrection, this is the resurrection, by the way, that the Jews had been looking for centuries. They had it in all their teachings, their writings. They talked about a resurrection. It's in the Dead Sea Scrolls, by the way. All sorts of writings in the Dead Sea Scrolls about the resurrection that was coming, because those were pre-Christ, right? And this is also, by the way, what the Sadducees they would deny. Okay, the Sadducees, if you know much about the different sects of Jews, the Pharisees, the Sadducees denied this resurrection, that this was going to occur. They denied a lot of spiritual aspects of Jewish ancient beliefs, okay? And in that way corrupted Jewish understanding in their own special way. But this is the resurrection when Christ restored these righteous to paradise in 30 AD. That's the resurrection that the Sadducees argued against in the synagogues. They would sit on the stairs of the synagogues with the Pharisees and argue all day long over whether the resurrection was going to happen or not. This was it, 30 AD. Not 70 AD like the IBV or the CBV groups talk about. I believe they're wrong on this point. All right. So that was the Jewish expectation of that resurrection that occurred in 30 AD, where Christ restored them to paradise. So let's keep going here. So then after Christ's death, burial, and resurrection, and those people being restored to paradise, we have the 40 years between 30 AD and 70 AD. Now, the 40 years might seem significant if you think back into the Old Testament. I call it even in the first century, I call this the 40-year wilderness period. So you think back to the ancient Israelites and their bondage in Egypt, and then the 40 years in the wilderness where God was refining them. By the way, the wilderness is synonymous in many cases with the underworld. The wilderness is the place of demons in Jewish rabbinical thought. That's why they sent, by the way, the goat on Yom Kippur into the wilderness with the red sash tied around its neck. Okay, into the wilderness is the place of demons, the underworld. And at the end of the 40 years, what happened? They were brought into the promised land. Now, that's all thousands of years prior, right? Well, this 40 years seems to be what that one was foreshadowing. Because before the 40 years, essentially before Christ died and was resurrected, you had the bondage of the law. And then the 40-year waiting period was waiting for what? They were waiting in the first century for Christ to return and then bring the righteous dead, and we're going to talk more about that in a second, in 70 AD, into the, quote, promised land or heaven. So do you see the mirror image there, the perfect picture God gave the Israelites of what was going to come when the Redeemer came for them, okay? Established the kingdom, there was a 40-year waiting period before then all would be taken to heaven. Just like it was in the Old Testament with the Promised Land. It couldn't even be a clearer picture. But anyway, just thought I'd mention that. So then we come after the 40 years. The 40 years between Christ's crucifixion and the destruction of Jerusalem. I call that the wilderness period. The dead saints' spirits, those who were martyred for their faith during that 40 years, were then resurrected out of Hades and taken to heaven. All right? So that would be at 70 AD. Now that's not a physical thing, okay? These are the dead who are in Hades, their spirits being taken to heaven, okay? And that's what in Revelation 20, verses 5 and 6, we see it calls this the first resurrection. So it's interesting to me that although it seems I'm pretty confident about the narrative of Christ restoring the dead righteous in 30 AD to paradise. This is called in Revelation chapter 20 in 70 AD, the first resurrection, where then God takes the righteous dead from the 40-year time period to heaven. Okay, so there was a resurrection at 30 AD of all the dead righteous from Hades into paradise, into Eden. Then at 70 AD, there was a resurrection of all that had died from that point forward that were Christian. All that had died up until 70 AD, he resurrects them into heaven. And that's not necessarily into paradise, by the way. This is the ones that would, as it says in Revelation, wear the white robes. The ones that died for their testimony, that were martyred, they were beheaded for their faith. They were taken straight to heaven to reign on thrones with Christ. Okay, during the 1,000-year millennium, which we're now going to talk about. So the millennium, the 1,000-year millennium, started at 70 AD. Okay, so there was this thing called the first resurrection of the saints that died in the 40 years prior. And then the millennium starts with those people reigning on thrones. Revelation 20 tells us all about this. Okay, it's very clear. Especially if we take it at its word and we don't try to add things to it or change it with a different lens of the scriptures. If we just take it as plain reading, this is what it tells us. It's actually a lot simpler, I believe, than most people make it. So this does mean, by the way, as I believe, that the millennium is in our past. Because if it started in 70 AD and went 1,000 years, just as the Greek says, literally, I've looked at the Greek about 100 times. The Greek is specifically talking about 1,000 years. It's not metaphorical. It's not some symbol for a different time period. There would be no precedent in prophecy for that kind of a symbol, that kind of a metaphorical time period. It's just not something that's done. So that being said, it does get a little tricky in Revelation 20 at this point. Now, it's not just tricky for me, by the way. Almost every Bible scholar has problems with Revelation 20 verse 5. It gets a little tricky. Because Revelation 25 says the rest of the dead, and now it's talking, after it's just talked about the millennium period, the 1,000 years where the saints were reigning on thrones in heaven. It says the rest of the dead lived not until the 1,000 years were finished. And it seems in the context like it might be talking about the people during the 40-year period that did not die. Okay, so prior in the millennium period, we're talking about the ones that died for their faith. They were resurrected at 70 AD and taken to be on thrones, to reign on thrones in the millennium age. This passage is very hard to translate and understand completely. So I'll just leave it there. I won't pretend that I know exactly what this is saying. It seems to talk about some people other than the ones that died for their faith in the 40 years. Could mean the ones that died from then forward through the millennium age. So as I say in this next section here, it does seem like that's talking about another group resurrection at the end of the millennium, but it's really hard to be just sure on what exactly that means. Were all the ones that died during the millennium then resurrected at the end of the millennium, just spiritually, meaning their spirits come out of Hades? In fact, the general Christian understanding of the early church was that when you were resurrected out of Hades, that your physical body was taken out of the ground, the component parts of it, and it was reconstituted, remade into a glorified body that then was put back on your spirit, and then you were taken to heaven. So just so you understand that, the way that resurrection is thought of by the Christian church just after the time of Christ. Okay, the earliest Christians were talking this way, that's how it works. Your spirit comes out of Hades. It is your flesh, your body is taken out of the ground, reconstituted into a glorified body. You take that and you go to heaven. So just to clarify a couple points, the early Christian fathers and writings talk about wanting to reign with the saints after they died. So that's interesting because that means after Christ and after 70 AD, some of the Christians were still saying they were expecting to die and then reign with Christ, like those tribulation saints, the ones that died during the 40-year period and were taken to thrones during the millennium. So it's just an interesting comment you need to consider, that the early Christians also thought that they would go to reign with those saints after they died. So they expected to be immediately resurrected individually after they died, and they got their bodies reconstituted and given back to them and then sent to heaven. Okay, and they expected to be sent to where those saints were reigning with Christ and the Father at the thrones. Okay. All right, so that kind of gives you my views on resurrection. As far as currently, now, I do believe that as Christians, I'm leaning toward the view that when we die, we are immediately then taken by angels. Our spirit is gathered by angels. Our body is then reconstituted from the materials that are in the ground from our body being buried, and it is given back to us as a spiritual glorified body, and then we go to heaven. Okay, that's really the view I lean towards. I could give leeway and possibly think that we might still go and wait in Hades after we die, and not the bad part of Hades, not where you're being tortured, but the waiting place in Hades, just the same as where Adam and the patriarchs waited for Christ. I have a view where it's possible that we still could go there and wait for the end of things, when God refashions the world, makes the new heaven and a new earth, and the final judgment occurs, at which point we would then be all resurrected again together and taken to heaven. I'm just giving leeway for that. I personally hold the view, for the most part, that when you die, you're immediately taken to be in heaven, in the rest that's in heaven with God. So I hope that gives you clarity both on the corporate body view and the individual body view, and then my own personal view, which really deviates quite heavily from both of those views. So with that information, I want people to learn for themselves and come up with their own decisions and conclusions. I would never expect that people just accept what I say, but take the time and consider the things that I have said about my points on Adam and Eve and the death they experienced and when it would occur and the literalness of that death. And then the issues with both the individual body view and the corporate body view, specifically the corporate body view, where it metaphoricalizes the events of 70 AD into some kind of corporate salvation, okay, and corporate resurrection, when it's not even talking about resurrection. It changes the resurrection into something different, some kind of spiritual quickening, which is not what the Bible talks about, especially if you just take the Bible at its word. You, again, have to come with a pretense to understand it that way. So I would encourage you to really evaluate those things for yourself. But as always, you can ask me any question you want. On my website, you can get my email address and email me directly. It's actually one of the best ways to talk with me about things like this. or you can put a comment and I'll do my best to check those. So thank you for your time tonight, and I appreciate it. I hope you've gotten something out of this, and God bless. Take care.